This is The Collective Voice, and you're tuning in to Faith Transitions, conversations with young adults as they faithfully navigate the wide and varied transitions of young adulthood. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this episode of The Collective Voice. We are here with another episode of Faith Transitions, and this time is great. We have Chris Palmer, who is one of our collective council members, and I'm also joined here by Rudy Logan, who, if you didn't listen to Rudy's episode a couple weeks back, you should definitely go back and check it out. He also had a Faith Transitions episode, as he has been transitioning to Austin and joined our staff at Austin Seminary, and I'm doing a lot of other really cool things in Austin. But today, Chris Palmer is joining us from the city, New York City, which we have a lot of things to talk about that, which we'll get to at the end of your bio here. But this is what Chris says in his bio. It says, I'm a minister of Word and Sacrament, currently serving as associate pastor for young adult and membership at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City. I became a pastor because I believe that Jesus is good news for all people, a lesson I keep learning over and over every day. My wife, Catherine's a PhD student at Baylor University. We met when we were both at Princeton Seminary. Before that, I spent a bunch of years living in Scotland, where I work for the Church of Scotland. We should talk about that too. We've got one pup, Jed, and are learning the ways of the city. Catherine thinks that I spend too much time watching cooking videos and Philadelphia Eagles highlights on my phone. Go Birds. This is what we need to talk about, first of all. Rudy's a Commanders fan.
I know. I'm so sorry, Rudy.
Fan.
Yeah, I won't hold it against you.
Dallas, right? So there's a lot of NFC East issues going on here.
Go Birds, man. 11-2. We're looking good. Super Bowl or nothing.
I don't know, man. AJ Brown is stirring up a little trouble. I mean, he's been open, but that's a conversation you might want to have behind closed doors. So
he's always open, man. He's always open on the field. It's great news. Yeah, they're gonna figure it out just in time for the postseason. It's coming.
Is Saquon gonna break the record?
He already broke our single season rushing record, and we've still got.
No one cares about that one.
Wow.
The Eric Dickerson one.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't know, but I think the big question is he going to be NFL MVP, or is Josh Allen going to steal it from him? And I think because of the position they play, I bet it'll go to Allen. But I think Saquon, man. I have an Eagles t-shirt that just says fly, and it's a picture of Saquon when he jumped over the Jaguars DB backwards. Oh my gosh.
Incredible.
Come on, unreal. He's unreal.
That's pretty quick.
For everybody who doesn't pay attention to football, we apologize, but go check out the NFC East and you can get – I'm not even going to say anything about the Cowboys because let's just be honest, it's disastrous.
It's bad news.
We're here to talk about transitions and specifically transitions through the lens of faith. So you have had a lot of transitions as of late. But before we dive into what got you to New York City, I would love to just hear a little bit of background. And I kind of read your bio that we have on our website because you're a part of our collective council. But I also would love to know what's the bio that's not on paper.
That's a great question. I just also want to say I want to give a shout out to 787 before I dive into my personal story and say that it has been such a source of, I want to say joy, but I also want to say just kind of spiritual optimism for me. I think that we live in a time where there's a lot of soul searching the church is doing about what's coming next. And I feel like, Phil, folks like yourself, Rudy, like you, people who are just kind of injecting a lot of like buoyancy into the church. It's good news. It's good. It's a good time to be a pastor in the church.
Thanks,
yeah. So for me, what's the bio behind the bio? I'm a pastor's kid. That's probably the first thing, one of the foundational things. My mother is probably the biggest spiritual presence in my life. Grew up Presbyterian, and just I can remember being a little kid, and my dad used to preach in these small little coal mining towns in Pennsylvania, towns where there might be 9 people in worship on a Sunday at the Presbyterian church. And I can just remember like looking at him and being like, wow, I think I want to do this, even from a pretty young age. I got pretty later on, as what happens with, a lot of our young adults, and I was definitely not shielded from this, as I got pretty disenchanted with the church. The church is definitely not a place that is perfect, that lives flawlessly. And so I kind of ended up in high school, kind of walking away from it, ended up kind of coming back to the church through a more conservative campus ministry that was actually affiliated with the Presbyterian Church of America, much more evangelical, and yet kind of really taught me something about I saw people who were just giving up so much, who were so gifted and could, these were folks who like could amass a lot of money that could be in other kind of industries making, really decent livings for themselves. And they were choosing to kind of, start a church plant in Fishtown or in a part of Philadelphia that just wasn't really thriving economically. And I just kind of saw something in that. And I was like, I just like, there is something to this church thing. Later on, after that, I would realize I can't really agree with some of the exegesis that I saw in those communities, especially around women in ministry, around kind of queer folk and siblings in ministry. And so I knew I couldn't really stay there. And yet, a lot of the lessons I learned at that church really kind of follow me into ministry now. Yeah. And I think those are probably that kind of upbringing in those small coal mining pulpits, and then also that college ministry that really kind of brought me back into the fold. I would say those are probably the two biggest pillars that have influenced my later ministry in life, for sure.
Where did you do undergrad work at?
I lived in Philadelphia for a while, went to Temple University, go Owls, for a few years, ended up like fracturing my back in 3 places and was kind of laid out, literally couldn't get up, and had to, did a lot of my own kind of personal wrestling in that time about what I felt called to do. I was originally in school to be a music therapist, and then talking about transitions, really in that time where I was immobile for a number of months, a long time, took time off school and really felt kind of called to maybe try out ministry. And so ended up transferring to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, finished my degree there, and then came back to do seminary at Princeton.
So Chris, this is something that I didn't know about you. It's really intriguing. So you wanted to become a music therapist. What inspired that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of it's just like I love music, right? Like I was a choir kid in high school. I was in theater, right? Like I was always, I wasn't playing football. I wasn't, even though I love football, obviously, but I'm not gifted at it. So, I could play guitar. I could sing. My dad was a pastor, but he also sung in choirs around Europe. Did a stint at King's College in Cambridge and was just very much like just like in our household, music was always around. And so I think for me, I saw like a lot of the, even when my parents would drag me to church as a 7-8-year-old, right? Like music was always a part of it. I think that's what's something that's so unique about church is like, where is it that like we come around weekly and collectively listen to music? Like, where do we do that? If it's not just like elevator music, it's usually in church, right? It's usually in some kind of religious setting. And so I think I just saw from an early age the kind of transformational power, the healing that music could really bring about in people's lives. So when somebody said you could be a musician and help people kind of get through very traumatic chapters of their own lives, I was like, yeah, that sounds like everything I want to do.
That's really powerful. And I'm wondering, so after Scotland, is that when you came back across the water, attended this theological institution in Princeton, New Jersey? And I'm also wondering, while there, did you happen to marry, your love for music, your use of music as this empowering tool for others? Like, how did you marry that with your theological studies while at Princeton Theological Seminary?
Yeah, no, it's so good. And I will say too, I mean, just to rewind a sec, one of the things that was transformational for me that happened before I came back to go to attend Princeton was I worked for a year in the Church of Scotland in a kind of alcohol and drug rehabilitation facility. And so spent a lot of time, like every day of my week, right, I would be around folks who are really struggling with addiction of one way or another. Like I remember, back to the music piece, right? Like I remember we had this guy named Jim. Jim was a very big Scotsman, right? He was a large dude. But I just remember like I would turn on like Motown music, like I would turn on like Stevie Wonder. And I just remember Jim, who was, had a lot on it. He was a lot on his heart. And he would just start dancing for everybody in the middle of our center. And I just remember like, when Jim was the kind of guy that when he started dancing, everybody else would start to, you know what I mean? He kind of had that gravitational pull to him. And so again, just like
I believe that if we just danced more in the world, we would be happier people, right? We need more excuses to dance.
Yes, that's why David danced before the ark, right? I think for me, even there's a big difference between a place like St. Andrews, which is so economically privileged, right? And then going to a place, it was called Arbroath, which is a small little fishing town, which, if we don't have to go into the history, but because of relationships in Europe, a lot of the economic stimulus of that place had left. And when the money and jobs left, a lot of times it was the drugs that came in. And so they had, it was a hard place in a lot of ways. And yet it was really through the church. It was really through kind of that music that people found joy day by day. And so, and I think, Rudy, to your question later about how have I continued to marry that? I mean, I just think like at Princeton is, shout out Princeton Seminary. It's just a place that's so, I worked with some of the best theologians, historians who really just taught me like I'm very reformed, and who showed me like there's a long, deep history of like Reformed Christians really using music to like centering that in their ministry. So I did a thesis on John Calvin's theology of music, for example. And like one of the things that I got to learn was like over and over again, you would see these people who were in exile, these like Huguenots and these various Protestants in Europe. And we don't have a ton of writings, but in some of the writings we have from these exiled people, they would talk about entering Calvin's Geneva for the first time, and how it was the singing of the Psalms, that was the first thing that they heard when they came into this place of safety. And just these like transformational experiences that people had, some of whom were really, distressed politically, right? Were oppressed due to these like large structures around them. And so I just think I got to, in some ways, like really dig deep into that history. And it's been a really big gift for being a pastor now, for sure.
I love that you had that thread, have had this thread of music throughout. Yeah. I assume it's continued to play a role as you've transitioned out of seminary then into your calls into ministry.
Yeah, totally. I mean, not even just, it absolutely has. And I think in various ways and in kind of ever evolving ways. I think for us in the ministry that we do, particularly with young adults, that I think music is often one of the things that is really, that they really crave. That in some ways, I think a lot of people in this day and age, that they can, in some ways, they can go listen to a podcast that has a great sermon on it, right? They can go listen to their favorite preacher or whoever. And yet there's something about common singing, like sitting in a room with your friends, with people that you love, and singing a hymn together, that you can't get just by like listening to your favorite album right on your AirPods. There's an experience of kind of being in person together in an embodied way and kind of raising up a voice of praise to God. I mean, it's no secret that we end a lot of our meetings singing the doxology together. Yeah, and it's probably one of my favorite parts of all of our meetings, just to hear everybody else's voice.
I once had a young adult tell me that he thinks that music festivals are taking the role of church for many young adults.
It's fascinating. Right? Yeah.
Which shortly after that, I went and saw the Abbott Brothers in Red Rocks, and I was like, oh, this isn't a music festival, but I get it, right? There's like something so transcendent about like thousands of people, or like you said, just a room full of people being together and kind of like joining in one voice. And whether it's an Abbott Brothers song or whether it's a psalm that you're singing or whatever the song is, there's just something about it that brings you in harmony with one another, like as a double entendre, right? Like in a whole different way.
Yeah.
So that's really powerful. So I assume at some point you had to make the decision of, do I really pursue music ministry or do I pursue kind of more traditional ministry aspect of, and by I say traditional ministry, I mean like, I'm going to be a preacher. I'm going to be like kind of that more role. What was that like for you?
Yeah, no, that's, and and like I said, I in some ways I try and resist the dichotomy, right? Like you
must pick one, be one
or
the other.
Well, yeah, and ultimately I did, right? Like I'm not a music pastor. I don't lead worship musically for our church every Sunday. But I think something, right? The president, Craig Barnes, who is the president of Princeton, who I think is just a fabulous pastor, he used to talk about how that the preacher's soul kind of becomes a crucible where the gospel is worked out again and again in preaching, right? Like that the preacher is this person who kind of like at their best will try and like really hold the pathos of the people, right? And yet will try and speak hope directly into that space. And I honestly think that's what artists do, right? Like that's so often mirrored. Like if you listen to Emotionalism by the Avett Brothers, Phil, oh my gosh, like you want to talk about people who are holding the crucible of the world, like they understand, right? And I think that there's some way in which, like, for me, being a pastor became a calling to like attempt to live with a certain kind of spiritual depth that I think you just see artists live into over and over and over again. And so I think one of the ways that pastors are always learning from musicians, right, is that musicians are sometimes, there's always the trope about like the struggling musician, right? That the musician or the artist is the person who kind of is always kind of sad and morose and is just carrying the burdens of the world. And that might be an extreme, but I do think there's a way in which like artists are always teaching us what it means to like pay attention to certain places, to certain kinds of suffering or to certain kinds of joy, and to really kind of like what it means to give voice to those places of joy and suffering. And so I think in some ways, pastors are always learning that lesson over and over again from artists.
So, Chris, this puts some things in the context for me, because I believe I read somewhere that one of your favorite theologians is Bruce Springsteen. So now
Yes.
I get it, but I would love to hear more about why exactly Bruce Springsteen, speaks to you theologically in that way.
Oh man, Rudy, the boss, the boss. Yeah, Bruce Springsteen. I've actually never seen Bruce Springsteen in concert, which is a sad, sad fact. I think, for me, when you listen to a song, okay, so I'll give you an example. So for Bruce, when you listen to the album Nebraska, right? And he has this song, which is like a kind of sadder album that he wrote, a little bit darker, a little bit more mellow. It's definitely not like Born to Run, right? But in that moment, he has this song called My Father's House, where he talks about what it is to like kind of seek after this home. And I just feel like some of the ways that Bruce Springsteen taps into like the psyche of just, I don't know, this kind of 21st century working person who just is like looking for meaning, who feels like their day to day is just lived in this grind. And they're like, where do I find kind of hope and joy, right? I feel like there's something that he just gives voice to that in such a beautiful, beautiful way. And even in places of kind of yearning and perpetual kind of, I don't know, it's kind of wayfaring, right? When people feel kind of adrift, that Bruce Springsteen just has a way of like giving voice to that, and also just like not ever letting people feel hopeless about it. So that's why I think he's one of the greatest theologians of our day.
I think it's powerful because I'm noticing another through line in your life between seeing your father pastor in these coal mining towns with very small congregations, to your study of John Calvin and the relationship between his theology and music and how it spoke to the exiles, and then the music of Bruce Springsteen, right? And that how that's speaking to, as you mentioned, working class people in the 21st century. So I think it's powerful. It's moving the way that your faith is so, interconnected with musical expression, along with, speaking to the realities of people at the margins.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think, I come from a part of Pennsylvania that has always been kind of union country, right? Like Scranton, Joe Biden comes from Scranton, which isn't too far away. And these kind of old steel mills that have now been closed down. But there is a strong sense of kind of political organizing that's just kind of in the DNA of the places where I call home. And I also think that for me, right, like growing up in these places, I lived in a small little row home where you're really shoulder to shoulder with folks day in and day out, right? And a lot of these folks are, they're just trying to get by, paycheck to paycheck. And some of the most important conversations of their life is going to happen at the pub after they get off their shift and they're sitting there drinking a Bud Light, right? And that's where, in some ways, like that's just where ministry so often happens in these kinds of working class contexts. And I think for one of the things that my dad and my parents both just really instilled in me is like, for me, it was very important for them that I go to public school, right? It was very important for them that I be shoulder to shoulder with folks who, were living in that more precarious context than I was, that I was going over to dinner at people's houses where like, it was pretty evident that like it was maybe not as privileged as my upbringing was. And there's always a certain danger of voyeurism in that, I think, that you need to be wary of, right? But I do think like it means that like I feel comfortable in certain conversations, right? It means that now I feel comfortable in certain contexts. I feel comfortable when things are kind of spoken in a certain way. And it means that I kind of look for certain kinds of people when I'm doing ministry. And I advocate, and I try my best, I fail daily, but I try my best to kind of advocate for them because I love them, because I grew up with them, right?
Does it leave you feeling a bit out of place in a place like New York City? I mean, you're in Fifth Avenue, right? Like
Yes. It's the ultimate irony, right?
It is kind of ironic. Granted, you spent a good amount of time in Waco, so we can circle back to that if you want to, but like there's a bit of a transition period in between there, right? Where there's Waco's kind of an in-between, I guess, of those two realities.
Yeah, no, and it's so true. Like right now, when I go to work, right, when I take the subway, I live in Queens, right, and Queens. I mean, Rudy knows this, right? Queens is the probably the best place to live in New York City. I'm biased, but it's also just, it's got to be one of the most diverse boroughs in the world, right? It's just amazing to me. And, but then I take the subway into Midtown Manhattan and I walk usually by a flock of tourists who are taking pictures of the new Louis Vuitton building that was just went up. And, I walk by Gucci and Dolce and Gabbana, and then I walk into my office, right? It's like, what does it mean to do ministry here? And one of the things I love that I think spoke volumes about the congregation where I minister now was I remember the first time I walked in and kind of came upon the church and saw that this was one of the big churches on Fifth Avenue. And it was one of the only places that was, celebrating their homeless neighbors weekly, right? That was sharing a meal with our homeless neighbors like multiple times a week, right? That like when I remember the first time I walked up and it's like, okay, there's Tiffany and there's like a party going on outside for folks who look like they're sleeping rough on the streets. What's going on there? And lo and behold, it was the ministry of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church called A Place at the Table, where they're kind of welcoming some of our homeless neighbors every week. And just something about like the position, right? Like seeing that group of people, like I got lunch the other day and walked back by our A Place at the Table family. And I just saw one of our social workers out there singing with one of the gentlemen who weekly comes to our meal, and just singing Christmas carols. And there's just something about like, here are all of these like the nicest brands and whatever that you can buy in the world. But like, there's the kingdom of God, right? Like laying dormant, like amongst these huge buildings, in the songs that these people are singing. And I just think it's an amazing witness in a part of the city that really needs it.
That's beautiful. Do you feel like Waco was a good transition for you to get into that space? Like, if you feel like, put it this way, had you jumped from being in kind of rural town Pennsylvania, and I know you've probably been there a long time, right? That's where you grew up, but Princeton's unique in and of itself, that whole area. But
Sure.
do you think Waco was a good kind of, and I'm going to say stepping stone, not like a climbing the ladder corporate like a deal, but like just like a transition space from where you grew up to kind of an in between. Now you're, in the hub of the,
Oh yeah.
the world, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, Waco, some of my favorite years in ministry have come in Waco, right? I mean, I think that, and I will say, so just saying Allentown, where I grew up, my dad preached in these small coal mining churches, but Allentown's a city, right? Allentown's
Yeah,
probably
sure.
got 150,000 people in it. And so when I moved to Waco, it felt kind of similar just in terms of like size, maybe. Allentown's bigger, but but I think for me, one of the things that was astounding about a place like Waco, Texas, is that, it's the kind of place where if you need your windowsills changed in your house, you're probably just going to do it yourself. Like if you need some kind of like HVAC thing done, you're probably going to call your neighbor because you know that he or she used to do it. That there's just such a sense of like gritty community, right? It's like so much less kind of commercialized where I'm just going to like call the big HVAC company. And of course that does happen, but we lived in this neighborhood where it was predominantly a Hispanic neighborhood, and it was really mixed kind of socioeconomically, and it was so beautiful. And just the kind of ways that you saw people show up for each other in that neighborhood, who were willing to kind of give themselves to community, that there's such thick relationships in Waco, Texas, where people still just know how to do community so well there. In part, I think because it's small town Texas still, right? Yeah, so I loved it. But I do think you're right, Phil. I think there's a way that maybe especially moving to a place like New York, that one of the things that this transition has really forced me to learn is that here in New York City, those relationships look so different. The social kind of ecosystem is like night and day. Like in Waco, everything was 15 minutes from everything else. And in New York City, if I can get to a coffee meeting in an hour on the subway, that's like I'm doing well for myself, right? And so there's just a way that I think you're always kind of navigating part of ministry, and part of like ministering in the transition is always kind of learning, what is the kind of social DNA of this place? What are the burdens that people have to carry just to get to a coffee meeting or just to have a drink with you after they get off their shift, right? And I think for me, really kind of learning those differences has been super vital. And I'm still learning about them. I definitely haven't mastered them yet.
So I'm wondering, Chris, to Phil's point earlier about Princeton, being its own kind of place and following Princeton, doing ministry in Waco, right? And living in this neighborhood with this spirit of grit and mutual aid. Like, given what Princeton is, as this bubble of wealth and affluence and so forth, compared to Waco, do you feel like Waco following Princeton was something that you needed for your ministry?
Yeah, and I did a residency for 2 years before I went to Waco. Waco was my first installed pastoral position. But I do think, one of the things, and Rudy, I mean, we went to school together at Princeton. I mean, I'd be curious on your thoughts on this. I feel like going to Princeton and then going to work in a church don't always feel like the most like parallel experiences, right? And I think this is something that people really struggle with when they go into churches, right? Princeton is a gilded place. It is a wealthy place. It is a place where, you walk downtown and the shops probably look like what are outside of my doors, right? You have Ralph Lauren and all these places.
People
And
run
yet
those
then
Ivy, right? Like that's the kind of mentality you get.
Exactly. It's beautiful. And I would never change those are some of my favorite years of life and would never change it. And yet I do think that finding ways of helping people adapt to what is church like in the real world is a question mark, right? I'm not sure if the education that I got really helped me make that transition. And I think when you're not looking for it, I think I was super fortunate to have a lot of mentors and relationships that helped me navigate that transition. But I think that, one of the reasons why pastors face so much burnout, one of the reasons why we have such kind of like high levels of people dropping out of ministry, I think it's because there's such an asymmetry in how we prepare people for ministry and how they're actually doing it when they get out. If you don't work at like a church like a Fifth Avenue Presbyterian, which, we're fortunate here to have a multi-pastoral staff, and it's an amazing group of people that I get to work with. But if you're working in like a smaller context, it's different than when it was like when you were in ministry, in seminary. And so I think for me, Waco was a place where I had such fabulous colleagues. I got to work with this amazing pastor. Her name is Reverend Dr. Leslie King. And she really, I think, helped me make that transition in a way that was really healthy. And she was also a person who was never willing to let me give in to my like disillusionment, right? And who was always going to say like, who was always going to kind of bump me to get beyond it and say like, hey, let's keep building something here. We're not done yet. And I think that some of my, I would wish that kind of presence for all of my friends who entered into ministry.
That's beautiful. We all need somebody like that in our lives.
Yeah.
So again, thinking about transitions, who are the people who have really helped you? Obviously, who you just mentioned, but who are the other people who have helped you navigate the transitions you've had through young adulthood? Who have been your guides, maybe?
Like when I was a young adult, or in
just anyway, any of the transitions you've navigated through. Who are the either mentors or guides or people that you've turned to?
Yeah.
When you're trying to discern or figure out, like, I got options ahead of me. What are my next steps going to be? Who do you turn to in the midst of that?
I think, again, it's back to like the artist thing about like the spiritual depth. Like the people that I often want to rely on are the people who I feel like they have that, like they've done that deep soul work, right? Like there are some people in my life who I'm like, there is spiritual wisdom embodied in you, and I need to sit at your feet, right? And I think for me, a person like that, like I have a mentor. Her name is Jane Long, and she's an elder, right, at the first church that I grew up in, and she was one of the first people who really identified gifts of ministry in me. I've known her for, decades, right? And yet she still to this day continues to be an abiding presence in my life. And then also, but also I think it's been helpful for me to have people both outside of the church and inside of the church to do that work. I think there are some perspectives that you are gifted with from both of that location that people have. So like I definitely have great pastoral mentors, right? One of the guys that I worked with in Arbroath in Scotland, his name is Martin Fair. Martin's been an incredible force for good in my life, but also people who aren't in church, right? Like I think for me growing up, I didn't have a lot of friends who went to church. Church going was kind of an odd thing. And I really got to hang out with some friends who kind of thought the things I did was weird. And I do think that part of my discernment, I think like listening to those voices that are like, I just don't understand this. Like that's so helpful, right? That's because that's clarifying for you. Like, why am I doing this, right? And so I have one of my really good friends, his name's Joe. And, Joe and I grew up about 2 blocks away from each other. And Joe's a public school teacher at a middle school in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He is one of the smartest dudes I know, and he would never admit that. But yet, just like listening to him, I think has always been a source of edification in my life. So, and he's definitely, he was raised Roman Catholic, doesn't go to church, thinks it's kind of weird, but is kind of interested in it. And I don't know. So I think those diversity of perspectives is always helpful.
So one of the things that I've just been asking young adults as I've been going along, and this is partially just selfish because I'm still seeking this too, but where are the places that you're finding beauty right now?
What a good question.
Just, I feel like transitions can disrupt a lot of things in your life. So in the midst of transition, it's important to root yourself in beauty. So where are you finding beauty?
So many places. I don't know why I just got like really emotional as you asked me that. One place, not only do like the kind of surface level answer would be to say, well, I live in one of the greatest art cities in the world, right? But yet and of course those things are beautiful.
That's true. True. And yes, and.
Yeah, true. And yet I think for me, like this congregation, right? Like I think the lovely thing about working at a church is that you just get to see people show up for each other in just incredible ways, right? And like whether it's so-and-so just got a cancer diagnosis, next thing you know, they're overcome by people who just want to bring them meals or some of our young adults, right? If they're out super late at night. I had a young woman share a story with me about a member from our church who she could really rely on, call upon when she had an uncomfortable experience on the subway, right? Really, really late at night. And somebody from our congregation, she was like, I just knew that person was not going to leave me. And just like that kind of community, I think just is beautiful. I also, and this is something that I'm super excited about, is Catherine and I are expecting our first kiddo in March.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We're terrified and amazed.
Talk about a transition, huh?
Yeah. And, I think for me, I have not met that little human being yet. And yet I think for me, it's really opened up the potential of being a father has really opened up a kind of new chamber in my heart that I didn't know existed. Yeah. So I think for me, really, it's community. It's that new venture we're on. And then of course it's Christmas in New York. Like it's beautiful, right? You walk around, people are just excited. There's lights, there's music. It's great.
Yes. Christmas in New York sounds magical. And one day maybe I'll get to experience that. Never been
got an open bedroom.
Oh, fantastic.
If you don't mind a toddler crying, you are welcome to come.
Been there, done that, my friends.
Yeah.
I'm really excited for you guys because I can remember like seeing you and Catherine walking on the quad, bundle of joy you're getting ready to welcome in your lives.
Thanks, Rudy. That means a lot. Thank you.
Beautiful. So beautiful. So thank you, Chris, for being willing to share and be open and vulnerable and more than anything for being willing to follow God's call on your life and the various places it's taken you across the country and to continue to pursue that. And we're grateful that we get to be a part of that in the midst of 787 Collective as well. If people want to learn more about the ministry you're doing at Fifth Avenue, where should they go?
Check us out on Instagram. We have a group. We are FIA, FAPC. We call our young adult crew FIA, Fifth Avenue Young Adults. And if you just search FIA, FAPC in the search bar, it will show up. And we would love to have you check us out. Let us know. Drop us a line. Get in touch. Love to talk with you.
All of our listeners in New York City, I don't know if we have listeners in New York City, but all of them who do, they can come find you.
Please. I'm
sure a lot of people drop by too, and there are a lot of tourists in New York City, so I'm sure people come and visit a lot, huh?
It is both amazing. The number of people that think we're a Catholic church and who cross themselves when they come in is amazing. Yeah.
No, it works.
We welcome it. We welcome everybody.
That's awesome. Well, again, on behalf of 787, thank you for all you're doing. We're grateful to have you on the Collective Council and your leadership there as well. And we just bless you in the ministry you do. And we look forward to more opportunities to engage in the future.
Thanks, Phil.
There's so many more things we can talk about. I hope you'll come back on the pod too. I know there's just a lot of things, a lot of avenues and rabbit holes we could have gone down. So we'll have you back.
Let me know.
All right, man. Blessings all.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Collective Voice, the premier podcast of the 787 Collective. For more information, visit us at 787collective.org or find us on the social medias at 787collective. And if you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate us, and share a review of us. For when you do, you are tricking the algorithm for the common good.